Well, hello, everybody. I'm Deborah Aho Williamson, Principal Analyst covering social media at Insider Intelligence. It's really great to see you, and I really hope you've enjoyed all of the sessions you've seen so far today. And thank you for joining our last session, Ask the Analyst, How ChatGPT and Generative AI Will Change Marketing and Commerce. Not a small topic at all. I'm sure we'll have lots of great questions. This is our live audience Q&A, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Yori Wormser, a principal analyst who covers connectivity and tech, Sky
Hey,
Canavas, senior analyst of retail and e-commerce, and Jeremy Goldman, who is our senior director of the marketing, retail, and tech briefings. Throughout today, you've sat on panels about the outlook for streaming, for CTV, social targeting, new search opportunities, and of course, Andrew Lipsman's really thought-provoking new digital ad economy session just moments ago. And I have to say, given that I live in Seattle, it's absolutely fascinating to contemplate the challenge that is going on between, and the battle that's going on between Seattle and Silicon Valley right now. So we'd love to answer your questions on those topics, but we really want to also answer your burning questions about the elephant in the room that I just alluded to, which is generative AI. You can submit your questions by using the chat window on the right, and go ahead and get started if you've got one right now. And make sure you also let us know where you're tuning from. So with that, I think I'd like to go ahead and get started. While questions are coming in, I'd like to kick things off with some things that we heard and some great questions we received during our sessions earlier today. And so I think I'd like to start actually with you, Jeremy. We heard in one of the earlier panels today about search marketing and how it's changing. And there was a question about, well, what are some of the biggest ways that AI is changing search marketing? And one challenge that I heard when I listened to the panel was that there's a lot of excitement about being able to experiment with the new AI tools, but also there's a lot of implications for SEO and the flow of traffic around the internet. So what's your viewpoint on that?
Well, people are very concerned. They obviously have a right to be, given the fact that their entire business model is upended. If you just look at how concerned are U.S. Content marketers that the implementation of AI and search engines is going to have, massive ramifications for them. A recent BMB study found that 21% were extremely concerned, another 21% moderately concerned. So there are a lot of people out there that have that anxiety. And part of it, I think, is because we're still in the middle of this evolution, right? We know the fact that people will actually start to search pretty often in a very different format to the way that they've always been searching. And that's happening now, but it's interesting to think about, well, over the next 5 years, how much of that search volume winds up going into chatbot, these chat interfaces, And first off, there's the question of how much do U.S. adults and everybody else, do they trust these search results, that are generated by AI? There's some conflicting data from Ipsos about that. So ultimately, a lot of things are shifting in a very short time period, but the key thing is to spend as much time as possible being aligned with the roadmaps of Google and Microsoft in particular when it comes to search.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. And, one of the things that I caught in your answer was that we're in the middle of this. I think a lot of people would feel like we're barely out of the starting gates. And it feels like we're, racing in like the Kentucky Derby or something like that, because things are moving so quickly. So Yori, we got another question that's somewhat related to this, a little bit more specific, and it's about Google. And the question was, how will Google's new AI search impact website design and development? That's also a huge topic, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it in some ways, it's a continuation of what we've always had with SEO and search engine optimization. You still want to have content that responds to what Google is looking for, that has what Google is looking for. So you want to be able to still optimize your website. But there's a bigger question also if search engine optimization, if Google is condensing answers and being sort of the end of a search by providing a succinct answer, you may want to think about ways to monetize differently than through advertising if they're not sending traffic to your site. And that's a much bigger question. That's kind of an existential question that I think a lot of digital publishers are going to have to face in the next few years. How do they continue to monetize if advertising acts in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a really big topic. I know, Jeremy, you alluded to just being on the top of what Google is doing. And, things are changing quickly. I mean, do you have any specific ways that you can think of or to recommend on how people can just make sure that they're in sync with what Google is doing and changing about AI search?
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, be a client, subscriber. That's generally helpful. But I do think that, in all seriousness, there are a number of announcements that are coming out of Google. I've definitely seen more agencies that I speak to try to essentially do a bit of a test and learn. So they'll actually play with their website, with their interface, look to see if they can do certain things, kind of like people tried to get aligned with Google with respect to web snippets a few years ago when those were coming up. And they would actually, these brands that are working on their sites, they would play with their interface and look to see what changes would essentially in real time start to impact their search results. So I think you're going to start to see a lot more of that, which is paying attention directly to announcements from Google, and then also playing with your interface and then seeing what ramifications that has for your overall organic traffic.
Yeah, you talked about test and learn, and coming from the social media space where I've been an analyst covering it for a really long time, I feel like that mantra has been huge over the years. I mean, everything's constantly changing in social media, and what's so interesting about search, in my opinion, is that for years it was just sort of kind of boring, right? I mean, it was Google and everybody else, and now there's this enormous change going on where any one of a number of players could really wreak havoc on the market. So definitely an interesting place to pay attention to. And Jeremy, you gave some awesome advice. I'd like to move into a couple of really great live questions that we're starting to get in. So one of them is about marketing jobs. And the question is, what marketing jobs will generative AI change the most? I'd like to open that up to all of you. Who has a thought on that?
I think it will certainly impact all of the jobs that have content creation or production role. And we're already seeing that because generative AI can just make content production and creation, whether text, image, or video, so much more faster, rapid. And at the same time, because it's a AI tool, there's going to be a need for marketers to still monitor that content, look at what's coming out, vet it. There are all sorts of, bigger issues with AI in terms of bias, data privacy, copyright as well, that people will still have to pay attention to. So it's not going to take over jobs, but it's really going to be more like a partner for marketers that are involved in these areas.
I think for most marketers, I agree with Sky that it's going to really hit almost anyone in the creative side, but everyone's going to have to learn how to prompt engineer well. I mean, that's constantly evolving, but you really need to know how to get the best out of all of the AI systems you're working with. So for everyone, I think that's going to be an important factor.
I was actually doing an interview where this came up the other day, where somebody was actually saying that the lines are going to blur a lot more between engineering and marketing. You even have people like me that are playing around and figuring out how to integrate ChatGPT into other things. As you're watching the NBA finals, it's the kind of thing that has become easy enough that the average marketer is tinkering around with. So I suspect that, definitely agree with Yuri. I think that you're going to see a lot more semi-technical marketing jobs where people are just going to build on top of generative AI interfaces and do really interesting things with it. And also Sky's right, where there are a lot of, I want to say, quasi-menial production jobs that nobody's that excited about doing. And I think, frankly, we are going to see a lot less of those over the next few years.
And I just like to say, just from the social media perspective, I mean, we've already seen a lot of changes happening with generative AI being used in social media. And for example, creating posts or changing, a long blog post into something that is shorter and could be repurposed into, say, LinkedIn or to other social platforms. That, I think, is a skill in and of itself, too. In some ways, obviously, it's going to reduce the amount of work that people will have to do to create new content. But I think it's going to also create a new generation of what you would almost call artists. And I mean that in a broad sense, not necessarily people who design images or videos, but people who really have an art to producing social media copy. I mean, I don't believe that generative AI is going to reduce the need for people to be creative and to let that creativity shine across whatever that they do. So I want to move back. So we did get another question that was earlier in today's sessions, but it does kind of relate to this because it's a bit about the internal organization of a company. And that question was, do you foresee that AI will make companies more homogenous or versus more differentiated? Skye, what do you think about that? I know you cover retail and e-commerce, but are there implications for that in the world that you're looking at?
Yeah, so I think from a brand or retailer perspective, I think there are some valid concerns in terms of customer-facing content around kind of the blandness of generative AI content, and that a lot of what's written or produced in terms of text or images has a similar look and feel. It's machine made essentially, and I think that's pretty true where the tools are now. If they're just left to their own devices, I think it's important to look at Gen I content that comes out of an initial prompt as really a very preliminary, rough first draft. And it needs to be refined with constant human interaction to improve. And gradually that content's going to come out better and more differentiated and be able to project the specific brand voice or look and feel. But that really takes a lot of time, attention, and creativity, especially. I mean, we've already seen some great viral memes come out of generative AI, and some of them involve brands as well. Whether the brands are actively participating in them, they're able to bring a lot of attention to brands and show kind of how generative AI can be used to make a brand stand out. And one other thing I'll say is that a lot of product content we see online is already pretty undifferentiated. A lot of product listings, they're already, kind of generic. And if you think about these things, sometimes for companies, the problem is that they don't have enough content or resources to devote to content, especially across different channels. So that's where these tools can also just add some very basic value.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, just from a media perspective, that if you over rely on generative AI, you risk commoditizing what you're producing. Like there is going to be that sameness, and that value add that you add from a human interaction is going to be more important for the companies to thrive. That base layer, everyone's going to have to use generative AI, but that value add of to differentiate yourself is going to be super important.
Absolutely. By the way, and Debbie, I know since you know this, since you know all things social media, I mean, the brands that tend to succeed, generally, they are doing these fantastic, interesting things, and everybody pays attention to them. And then what they do is copycat, bottom feeder content. There is a lot of content that is clickbaity and low value online. So in some ways, this is just a progression of what we've already been seeing, over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years from a content standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do raise a really great point, Jeremy, which is that in social media and just in marketing in general, I mean, there's always kind of the race to be first to do something and to get a lot of credit for it, and we're seeing that with Gen AI, and I mean, I think some of you have already pointed that out. But the other danger, and I've seen this when looking at some generative AI tools that I've been looking at just for personal productivity reasons. There's a tool that enables people to make comments on LinkedIn posts very quickly. And I can only imagine that that's going to just create more and more noise on LinkedIn and not actually contribute to the conversation. So I would hate to have a social platform be ruined by lots of generative AI driven posts that look like commoditized content. I mean, that would really kind of destroy the whole ethos, I think, of the nature of social media.
Debbie, can I just to respond to that also? I think what's really interesting is that all of the platforms, everybody's very worried about this, and I think we rightly should. But I feel that all the platforms that you cover, at the very least, they're aware that this is an issue that they're going to have to solve. Just from a brand safety and from a time spent on, platform. Nobody's going to want to be on platforms if they can't clean up their acts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many issues. I mean, misinformation is another big one with generative AI. We've seen cute things like the Pope and a Balenciaga and a few other things like that, and then we've seen really there's scary ways that generative AI can be used to spread misinformation and false viewpoints. And so in social media, I think it is a huge issue for the social companies. And they're really just still trying to wrap their arms around the idea of content moderation, right? Like it's just not even something that they've been able to master even without generative AI. So I think I have another good question from our live Q&A that I want to turn to. It's a little bit on a different topic, but I think it does, well, actually it is kind of related because it relates to the walled gardens, and many of those are social platforms. The question from the live question is, do you see the rise of a series of walled garden AIs to protect IP? So that's an interesting thought on that. I'm going to just open it up again to any of you who have a viewpoint on it.
I definitely think you're going to see it in business, at least, because one of the dangers of AI right now is that they learn by ingesting everything you give them, and it becomes part of the program, and then it can spit out something that's very similar to your intellectual property. So I definitely see companies for their own internal data creating their own walled models and hiring models, large language models, generative AI models that protect your data. So I definitely see in that aspect of it, not just happening eventually, but happening very, very soon.
Another interesting take on that question is, this is maybe a little bit different spin on it, but something that I've been curious about is the actual, the AI platforms like, a Meta, for example, making their AI open source versus like an open AI making it more closed, right? Like that walled garden. So, I mean, do you think with a platform like Meta that they're running into risks in making that, making their AI open source and allowing developers to build on top of it in the way they are?
Short answer is yes. I think that there is a danger there, and then there's the broader danger that they expose their code to people who want to create malware out of it or abuse it in some way and take advantage of it. But there are a lot of advantages to open source as well. You have it out there, and people can build their own programs. Just as they can use it for bad purposes, they can use it for good purposes. So for Meta, who wants to expand their reach, it makes a lot of sense, I think.
So, we have another live question here, and I'm actually going to break it up into two parts because I think there's a lot to unpack. So the first part of the question I want to discuss is this one. When will key players be able to set the standards in AI? Or they say, kind of, I think provocatively, will the actual AI determine that? That's a big question. Do we have a sense at all, like when and if there will be standards in AI that are set by certain players?
I'll just say I love that question. I think that it all depends how we define standards. I think if we're talking about some of it might just simply be, from a regulatory standpoint and enforced at a higher level. I think also that is almost the argument that Meta might have towards open source, is that becoming essentially the AI operating system, that connects us all. That's essentially the theory behind that. But I think also, can you really standardize AI? I don't think you can, because we don't even know necessarily where it'll go. And I think that it's fine to have entirely different, user experiences with different types of AI. There'll be a few things that, the average user will just get used to that AI will do for you. And if you introduce something different that falls outside user expectations, it's going to be rejected. But I think that you will see a lot of variance in the same way that you go to different e-commerce sites that Sky covers, and they have different interfaces, but they have some similarities.
Sky or Yori, what do you think? I mean, are there any winners in the key players being able to set the standards in your mind?
I think it's still a little early to say because there's so much activity happening and so much lobbying clearly with the big players who want to have a say in how this is regulated. And at the same time, the technology is just moving so much faster than the regulatory bodies possibly could. I think one area that's really going to draw a lot of attention for brands, marketers, and any creatives is the IP side of generative AI, because and on both ends, both in the content that's being ingested by these large language models, a lot of that content is public, but it's copyrighted, and it's being used by these AI models. And on the other side, the output right now, it's not copyrightable, but shouldn't it be if a brand is creating its own content using a proprietary model that it's developed? I think there are going to be a lot of questions around that need to be resolved and sorted out, and it's going to get pretty messy.
Yeah, and I just want to add that just the cloud companies that host these a lot of these large language models, I think they're all creating their own kind of plugins and ecosystems around that, but they're all going to eventually be able to talk with each other. And so it's really, I think, going to be the regulatory agencies that will probably set most of the standards.
All right. Well, we've gone very very deep into the tech space here and into what key players are going to potentially be or not the leaders. I'd like to just kind of go back real briefly though to the impact on some of the industries that we cover. And so the question came in, I think maybe Skye, this would be a great one for you, which is what sort of impact will generative AI have on retail media?
So I think initially, at least, advertisers that are using retail media networks are going to be getting more access to tools on the ad platforms that really help them to improve their ad content, the text, the images, 3D imagery, video, all of these types of content can be improved and iterated on or multiplied with generative AI tools. Amazon, I believe, is reportedly working on this now, but so are the other big players in digital advertising, namely Google and Meta. So it's not retail media specific. But I think one of the things we'll see is as retail media expands offsite, the demand for content that suits the channel being used is going to multiply. And that's another area where AI tools can help to tailor the content to the platform, whether that's CTV or social channels. And because I think it's still the case that many brands lack the resources to develop as much content as they'd like to or as they should. And we know generative AI is a pretty cost-effective solution to creating more content that can drive more engagement and conversions. And then I think longer term, we'll start to see a lot more personalization in advertising, because we're going to go from customer segment targeting to very individualized targeting that can be based on specific shopper profiles and their browsing history and purchase history. And then as we have AI chatbots taking on a larger role in that product search and discovery process, there'll be more opportunities for advertisers, but it's going to look very different from what most of retail media looks like now, which is through search. If you have an AI shopping assistant, that's not going to come back with potentially hundreds of product listings where you could insert a significant share of sponsored listings in there. It's going to be much more personalized and targeted. And so it's going to look very different how you integrate an ad or a campaign into that, because it's going to have to be far more relevant to the individual consumer and really meet their expectations in terms of what they're looking for specifically at that moment.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I am getting the signal that we are at the end of our time. So I am sure there are many, many more questions about generative AI that you all have. The good news is all of us analysts are very focused on generative AI across all of our coverage areas. So if you are a client of Insider Intelligence, definitely stay tuned for more research on the topic. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have. And it's also a wrap on our June Attention Summit. I want to thank Skye, Yuri, and Jeremy for joining this session and providing really great feedback and answering some of your questions. Our production crew behind the scenes deserves a huge round of applause for all of their hard work. But also you who attended and participated and listened to our sessions. Thank you very much. I want to remind you that everything's going to be available. It's actually already available on demand, and you can watch them now, you can watch them later, you can share our sessions with your colleagues, and you'll be hearing from us soon about our next summit. So thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great weekend.